The Northwest has been considered to be one of the greatest places of nature in the United States of America. Washington alone has over 22 million acres of forest land, which totals to be around half the entire area of Washington. The 3 national parks, North Cascades, Mount Rainier, and Olympic National Park, span a total acreage of over 1.67 million miles. Although a diverse group of animals live there, the northern spotted owl is among one of the most fascinating. However, the conflict and battle for the ecosystem of this organism has long been part of the state's history. And this is the conflict of the northern spotted owl and the attempt to preserve them. By 1848, the California Gold Rush resulted in an explosion of the population in the Northwest. New settlements and towns in the Northwest were now in desperate need of supplies involving lumber. As a result, mills opened up all around the Northwest. By the mid-1850s, there were over 24 mills in the Puget Sound alone. As time progressed, the timber industry grew larger and larger, from exporting millions to several billion board feet. People started to worry about the amount of power the logging industry had, and thus, the United States Forest Service founded the Division of Forestry to attempt to curb and regulate foresting in 1881. 10 years later, the Forest Reserve Act was created in order to more effectively combat logging. This Forest Reserve Act allowed any president of the United States to set aside forest reserves from the public domain.
The economy out here was a generational economy. Grandparents were involved in the business, the parents, the children. And so when you take that away from them, that's a pretty significant cultural impact to their way of living.
The way of life for my family, and it has been since I'm 19 years old.
Those of us that live and work with the woods, we really respect the woods and we want to protect the woods.
As time flowed onwards, a new set of problems arose for the loggers. Spotted owls, a unique type of bird, became a new controversial subject.
Spotted owl controversy essentially got started because people figured out that they were fairly limited to these mature forests that were being logged at a pretty high rate. So protections for the spotted owls ran into people's desire to cut these forests and make money off cutting these trees.
Ways you lose old growth because people move in and put houses or convert it to agricultural land, but most of it is logging, and they are specialists and they have to have their habitat requirements. They nest in old trees.
As a result, by logging areas in Washington, spotted owls were beginning to become endangered. In 1981, the Oregon-Washington Interagency Wildlife Committee recommended that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should provide the owls with a buffer zone of 1,000 acres of old-growth forests around each owl for protection. 5 years later, the Forest Service decided not to propose their original idea. Instead, they suggested that 690,000 acres in total be reserved for just the protection of the owls. In January of 1987, a small environmentalist group operating out of Massachusetts, known as Green World, sent a petition to the Fish and Wildlife Service to list the northern spotted owl as endangered. Over 30 major environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club, will be forced to back Green World's petition. Despite evidence, in December, the petition would be rejected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Only a year later, U.S. District Judge Thomas Zille would rule that President Reagan's administration had arbitrarily denied endangered species status to the northern spotted owl. And as a result, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was given 90 days to justify its decision. As this pertinent issue continued onward, so did another. The Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund had filed a lawsuit against the Forest Service to discontinue the logging of spotted owl habitat. Surprisingly, District Judge William Dwyer ruled in favor of the Sierra Club. Timber sales were halted in western Washington and Oregon until the Forest Service would come up with an adequate plan to save the spotted owl. In June of 1989, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced its decision to list the spotted owl as endangered. The Fish and Wildlife Service had 1 year to configure a plan to implement these changes. Protests, petitions, and anger filled the Northwest.
That is sensationalism.
Hey, I've heard it on TV with my own 2 ears.
You shouldn't believe.
people were mad and they hated the park and they hated people studying spotted owls.
Timber companies claimed thousands of jobs would be lost to an owl, while environmental activists stated that less than 1,000 people would lose their jobs.
People thought it was going to be the end of logging and their way of life, and there is less timber coming off of Forest Service lands.
Despite anger from logging companies and employees, the Fish and Wildlife Service continued with their plans, and on June 22, 1990, the spotted owl was officially listed as an endangered species.
I think it's unfortunate that it was such a polarizing argument for way too long, and a lot of time was wasted.
President Clinton and Vice President Gore would announce in 1993 the Northwest Forest Plan.
It was one of the first things that happened in the Clinton administration, was that they're going to mediate a solution.
The Northwest Forest Plan set aside 30%, or 7.4 million acres of federal land as LSRs, also known as late successional reserves. LSRs would be reviewed and assessed by biologists by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
It was motivated initially to protect spotted owls, but because of this controversy, every time there was a proposal to do a timber sale, the environmentalists would sue and then the timber companies would sue, and the forests were basically just locked down with lawsuits. So they tried to come up with this plan that would balance protections for spotted owls in some places and then allowing timber harvest in other places. That was basically the resolution of that controversy, was passing the Northwest Forest Plan.
In 1994, as this plan was being officially implemented, Judge William Dwyer would uphold his original decision to stop most logging in the Northwest. And the Supreme Court decided in 1995 that the laws protecting spotted owls applied to private land as well.
Nobody could really agree on the best path forward, how much land needed to be set aside, what the conservation measures needed to be. It got everybody together. There were, I think, 9 options or something like that, and they went with one option. A judge ruled this is what we're going with.
The one thing that I think most people agree on is it's done what it said it would do for spotted owls. It hasn't done as good of a job at allowing timber harvest. There's still so many regulations within the plan that they've never cut as many trees as they said they were going to be able to. So rightfully so, some of the interests that felt like they were compromising on spotted owl protection haven't seen as much timber come off of the federal lands as they expected.
It's been revealed that despite all the attempts to preserve the spotted owl, their population is still declining at an alarming rate.
And what's happened, which was kind of unforeseeable, is that another species of owl that used to live in the eastern part of the United States, the barred owl, made its way to the west coast and has displaced spotted owls from most of the park and most of the areas outside the park that are still suitable habitat.
And this invader came in who's bigger and more aggressive than they are.
And so there are, not here in the park, but there are 3 or 4 areas, 5 areas actually, where they're shooting barred owls to see if spotted owls return to the places that they were at before barred owls moved in, which, as you can imagine, is as controversial as setting old growth aside.
It now leads questions on both a moral and analytical standpoint. Loggers are wondering if they lost their jobs for nothing, and why we continue to attempt to protect the spotted owl when reducing logging sales in areas for lumber has already been ineffective.
They took away so much of our logging, to protect the spotted owl, but it's steadily declined, anyways, even though they took it away from us.
And the thing that I want to share with you is that whenever you look at these environmental issues, you need to put a human face on what the issue is. And it's not one way or the other. It's not just save the spotted owl.
My advice is to try to get to the original literature and read the original science and not let the advocacy groups tell you what's happening.
Somebody's going to be impacted, so how are we going to deal with that? Whether we save more land for the spotted owl or whether we save less.